Welcome to Cleantech Forward, a Foresight podcast where we explore clean tech customers, capital, and Canada's path to net zero. Tune in to learn more about Canada's most exciting clean tech startups, industry success stories, investor insights, and academic initiatives as we accelerate the growth and impact of clean tech together.
This Cleantech Forward podcast is supported by Gowling WLG. A global leader in intellectual property law, Gowling WLG works alongside Canadian clean tech companies to develop IP strategies that maximize business opportunities and increase market share while protecting valuable innovation. From idea to investment to international expansion, Gowling WLG understands the potential of your intellectual property at every stage of growth. Visit gowlingwlg.com/cleantech to learn how they can support your business today. Welcome to Cleantech Forward. I'm Jeanette Jackson, CEO of Foresight Canada. Today, we're wrapping up our series on the adoption of clean tech. So far in this series, we've spoken to innovators who have successfully formed industry partnerships through Foresight's award-winning SDG Connect Challenge platform, and to some of our industry partners who have committed to reducing their emissions by incorporating clean tech solutions into their operations. If you haven't heard these episodes already, make sure you go back and listen. On this episode, we'll be taking a look at the state of clean tech adoption in Canada, the progress we've made as a country in the fight against climate change, and what we can do to speed up clean tech deployment. The adoption of clean tech must occur if Canada is to achieve our net zero goals. Despite the public declarations and pledges to implement policies and lower our emissions, we haven't really had a substantial impact on our national emissions. We have implemented a carbon pricing system, carbon tax credits, funding programs, and subsidies for clean tech development, but we haven't managed to do much but plateau our emissions at a historic high. Despite warnings from experts around the world and calls to action to reduce or limit our greenhouse gas emissions, the climate crisis continues to grow more severe and more urgent without any drastic action being taken to change our behaviors. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or the IPCC as we call it, recently announced the publication of the 6th edition of its assessment report. This report summarizes the state of knowledge of climate change, its impacts and risks, and our efforts thus far at mitigation and adaptation. In no uncertain terms, the report states if we take immediate, sustained action, we can save lives and avoid irreversible damage to our ecosystems. The 2023 IPCC report also outlines the damage already done by climate change and describes the potential interruptions to many of our critical life-sustaining systems if we don't act with urgency. The damage includes widespread and substantial impacts to our water availability and food supply, impacts to our health and wellness, a rise in infectious diseases, mental health incidents, and heat-related harms, and significant stress put on our infrastructure and damages to key economic sectors. The report has been described as a final warning with regards to the climate emergency and calls for decisive action to be taken in order to avoid what scientists say will be irrevocable damage to vital ecosystems. And it's timely for the discussion we're having today on this podcast. Climate change is a giant problem, and it's easy to feel overcome by anxiety when you begin to think about the enormity of the task ahead of us. It's going to require fundamental changes to the way we live our lives, the way we travel, the way we produce and manufacture goods, the way we grow and transport food, our consumer habits, and so on. It's just such a massive problem. It really begs the question, can we do it? Can we make the changes the climate crisis demands we make in order to sustain a livable future? Our guest today certainly thinks so. Seth Klein is the author of The Good War, Mobilizing Canada for the Climate Emergency. It's a book that draws many parallels between Canada's response to the Second World War and Canada's response to the climate crisis. Just like the climate crisis today, World War II was seen as an existential threat to our way of life that upended things like trade and security. But so far, our response to the climate crisis has paled in comparison to Canada's ability to mobilize activity during World War II. Seth argues that we have the ability to make the changes we need because we've done it once before. Here's Seth on his background and how he developed an interest in climate emergency and what he thinks of the progress we've made as a country in the fight against climate change.
I don't actually think of myself as an environmentalist. I think I come to this through the lens of survival. First of all, I cut my teeth politically as a teenager in the years before the end of the Cold War, uh, as an activist on another existential threat around nuclear war. And then I spent most of my career with the CCPA as a social justice research institute. And that's the lens through which I come to this work. But 15, 16 years ago, the CCPA started to do more and more work on climate and climate justice. It's one of the hazards of this work that the more you're following the science, the more alarming it becomes. And so again, it was really out of a sense of increasing anxiety, even panic about the future, that brought me more and more into a focus on the climate emergency. But it remains the case that while I see climate as an ecological threat, I see it just as much as a social justice issue and a civilizational threat.
In terms of my definition, I start thinking about things like water security, food security, energy security, and quite frankly, the impacts of climate change essentially destroying livable space on our planet.
Exactly.
And just a mass exodus of people to and from regions. And it's completely unpredictable right now. I find it's absolutely unpredictable in terms of where the next crisis is going to be, where the next floods are going to be, and how big they're actually going to be, because it's every year, it's big, it's different, it's just got no predictability to it.
That's right. I mean, it sometimes gets described as a threat multiplier. And I think what you're saying really distinguishes the climate crisis from, say, the pandemic experience we've all just shared, because as anxiety producing and disruptive as that was, it didn't upend our food and water systems the way the climate crisis is and will increasingly.
So your book, A Good War, discusses what could be done to refocus our politics and retool our economy to essentially achieve what scientists have recommended we need to do in order to fight and stop the climate crisis. What do you think of the efforts we've made in Canada so far? Keeping in mind things seem to be getting announced week over week. So how do you keep up to date?
Yeah, well, notwithstanding those announcements, I mean, I hate to say it, I think the response to date is that we're sleepwalking to a catastrophe. First of all, just to take a step back and explain the title of my book, A Good War. It's called A Good War because the book is structured around lessons from the Second World War. So I've spent a lot of time over the last few years in this study of emergencies, that World War II emergency, the pandemic emergency, the climate emergency. And the thing is, emergencies need to look and sound and feel like emergencies. And when you reflect on all of the climate actions and policies to date of the federal and our provincial governments, I guess I would put it to your listeners. Does it look and sound and feel like an emergency to you? And I don't think it does. When you look at the data around greenhouse gas emissions in Canada, for the last 20 years, it's just basically a flat line. This is, to cut to the chase, this is where we need to measure progress, is actual GHG emissions. And we have achieved precious little over the last 20 years, despite all the talk and all the pledges. The best you can say about it is that we've plateaued our emissions at an historic high. Now, I do think that particularly the federal policies that have come in the last couple of years are going to result finally in a little bending of the curve. But it's not going to be anything at the pitch and pace that the science demands of us. The response to date has been, we wasted a lot of time on incremental actions and trying to cajole and incentivize our way to victory. And it's not going to work. And it strikes me that notwithstanding the policies we've had to date, and again, I would put this to your listeners, at any point, does it feel like we are being invited to join in a grand undertaking? Because I'm not feeling that yet.
Despite the rise in frequency of so-called once-in-a-lifetime storms that are becoming more like once-a-year catastrophes, rising global temperatures, and increasingly urgent calls to action from the scientific community, we still have only managed to plateau our national emissions. In 2020, Canada's GHG emissions were 672 megatons of greenhouse gases, which is an 8.9% decrease from the 738 megatons in 2019. However, between 1990 and 2020, Canada's GHG emissions increased by 13.1%, or 78 megatons. We're still very close to our historic high, and we need to do more. So why haven't we? During the Second World War, CEOs of some of Canada's largest corporations signed up to be what we now refer to as dollar-a-year men. These individuals were business leaders who volunteered their expertise for the government in exchange for a salary of $1 a year. It seems kind of crazy to think that actually happened, given the economics today. Today, we find ourselves in a situation where even the suggestion of a change in consumer habit or alternative transportation method is met with resistance and even outright hostility by some. There are significant cultural changes between 1945 and today. And according to Seth, neoliberalism, the long-standing dominant political ideology in much of the world, may have a lot to do with our lack of willingness to act decisively on the climate crisis. That is to say, in many places around the world, the predominant belief is that governments should take a hands-off approach to the economy, and government regulation, even in the face of a crisis, should be avoided.
We confront the climate emergency after 40 years of a predominant neoliberal ideology, which has dampened our sense of possibility. I think one of the most insidious impacts of 40 years of neoliberalism is that it has sapped our imagination and our belief in our capacity to do great things together. And it's undermined social solidarity. So first of all, to the first part of your point, that is part of what was so remarkable about the World War II story. So you were alluding to the dollar-a-year men, I think, of which there were over 100 senior executives across the land who signed up to become dollar-a-year men and lend their expertise as business leaders, heading up, in the war. C.D. Howe, who was the minister responsible for munitions and supply in the Mackenzie King cabinet, and no lefty. I mean, he was sort of on the right wing of the Mackenzie King cabinet, and he'd come from the private sector. He'd made a lot of money in the private sector, but he created 28 crown corporations during the war in order to expedite this mass production of wartime materials. And then he recruited a bunch of his buddies from the private sector to head those crown enterprises up and to serve as controllers for supply chains and so on. There was this remarkable social solidarity. And also, particularly over these 3 years of the pandemic, we have seen really, I would say, a kind of grotesque level of profiteering in certain sectors: oil and gas, finance, retail, like retail grocery. That kind of profiteering was illegal in the Second World War. They had an excess profits tax in the war, what we would call a windfall profits tax today, because the Mackenzie King government understood that in order to mobilize a population, you needed social solidarity. And if you were going to have social solidarity, you couldn't ask some people to volunteer their lives while other people were making a killing. And remarkably, you had icons of business leadership in that era telling their fellow businessmen at the time that they had to suck it up and accept this, because that's what it meant to mobilize in a time of emergency. So all of that's missing today. But part of it is, in fairness to some of these business leaders, I think everyone's caught in a bit of a prisoner's dilemma. Like, nobody wants to be a chump. Nobody wants to be the one who does the right thing if their competitors aren't. And that's the benefit of having a decent tax fairness regime or mandates that say to those business leaders who want to do the right thing, don't worry about your competitors. They're going to have to come along.
And so is that a segue into some of the tools that you think need to be developed or even just deployed? I mean, it sounds like there's some fundamental things that we can copy and implement to get some mobilization of the right resources in action. Do you see a few critical things that we can do in Canada to get this right, like starting now?
Yeah, well, the framework that I employ, and it's drawn from my lessons of emergencies, is that I call them my 6 markers of emergency. These are, how do you know when a government or any large institution and its leadership are actually in emergency mode? And those markers are, first of all, you spend what it takes to win. Number 2, you create new economic institutions to get the job done, like the Crown Enterprises that C.D. Howe did. Number 3, and this is key, you move from voluntary measures to mandatory measures as needed. Number 4, you tell the truth about the severity of the crisis and what's going to be needed to confront it. Number 5, you make a commitment to leave no one behind. Harkening back to my point about social solidarity, if mobilization requires social solidarity and inequality is toxic to social solidarity. And number 6, you center Indigenous leadership rights and title. We're not hitting any of those markers yet. And, the fault for that isn't among business leaders. I think the point is speed and scale in the small window of time that we have has to be state-led. What we do need from business leaders is we need them, like those business leaders from World War II that I alluded to similarly disabuse their fellow business leaders that we can achieve speed and scale in any manner other than state-led in that way.
Are there some countries that are more progressive than us that we should be emulating, or is it just a global crisis and no one's really checking all the boxes?
So I would say there are no national governments that I can think of that are hitting all 6 markers as I just laid out for you. That said, there are many countries that are doing a lot better than us. It's interesting when you look at the climate polling in Canada, it's very important to Canadians that Canada be a leader on this. That's the good news. The bad news is that they mistakenly think we are. And if you actually look, I alluded earlier to our abysmal record on GHG emissions. If you look at Canada, this record against every other G7 country, every single one of them kicks our ass. Like we are the worst. So while nobody is nailing this, there are certainly countries doing better. And then there are the countries that need help in the developing world. And that's where another piece of spending what it takes to win is recognizing that we have a single atmosphere and we're going to win this fight with allies. And for a rich country like Canada, that means substantially boosting our international climate financial transfers to those countries that need to leap right into a fossil-free world. And so that's a piece of it too.
At Foresight, our BHAG, or our big, hairy, audacious goal, is to see Canada be the first G7 country to achieve a net zero economy. As we just heard from Seth, we still have a mountain to climb if we want to achieve that goal, but it's a goal that we can take seriously. It's a collective call from all of us at Foresight that we recognize the problem and Canada's position in the race to net zero, and that we need to move with purpose and urgency to achieve it. And yet, when I mention this goal to an audience, I get mixed reactions, from applause to laughter. It's not meant to be funny. It's meant to be a thought-provoking and galvanizing movement that we can organize around a common goal and get people moving in the same direction. It's intentionally audacious, and it can be hard to imagine the effort required to make the necessary changes. But if we look at history, we can find example after example of movements accomplishing huge leaps forward for progress after hard-fought battles.
We all have this question of this. We're plagued by these feelings of doubt. Like, can we really achieve something that audacious in the short time that we have? And when I set out to write my book, originally it was going to be a somewhat different book. I wanted to tackle what do we do about this harrowing gap between what the science says we have to do and what our politics seems prepared to entertain. And I was only going to have one chapter on lessons from the Second World War, because I thought, hey, for all of us who wonder, can we really do this in time? It's kind of an interesting story, because we did actually retool the whole economy in the space of 6 years, twice, in fact, once to ramp up military production, another time to reconvert to peacetime. And that's what led to me digging into that story. And the more I dug in, the more I saw more and more parallels and this hopeful reminder that when emergencies are recognized as emergencies and we really dig in, the speed and scale can be extraordinary. But let me emphasize again the point about marker 3 around mandatory measures and offer a wartime example. It's an American one, but I think it illustrates my point well. The Americans joined the war 2 years after we did. Pearl Harbor happened in December of 1941. In February of 1942, which is to say 2 months later, the last civilian automobile rolled off the assembly line in Detroit, and for the next 4 years, their production and sale was illegal. Now, that didn't happen because of the patriotism and goodwill of the big three automakers. It happened because they were ordered and had to be quickly retooled and converted to producing something else, which they did. You and I are both in British Columbia, where we seem to struggle to build a single BC ferry anymore. In the 6 years of World War II, from a base of almost nothing, just the BC shipyards built 350 ships, mostly big 10,000-ton merchant marine ships. They had to recruit naval architects from Britain and the US. They had to recruit and train up everyone. The Vancouver Shipbuilders Union local went from a small local of 200 guys to the largest single local of men and women in the country. That's what it means to be an emergency.
There are a lot of challenges facing the Canadian clean tech market. Because of our smaller market size, lagging adoption, challenges around procurement, and private sector underinvestment in clean tech, half of what we see in the US based on a per capita basis, Canadian clean tech companies often struggle to deploy their solutions here at home. It's hard to compete with the world's largest economic powerhouse right next door. So how do we stay competitive? And how do we empower Canadian innovators within our borders? According to Seth, having the government lead the charge on the adoption of clean tech is likely our best chance at closing that gap.
I feel grateful for the people in that industry and who are creating these technologies. We're going to need all of that. But the hard truth is, in the grand scheme of things, it's a side hustle. In order to scale up, to get that speed and scale, it has to be state-led. And the problem is that when you look at our federal policies in particular to date, they are trying to incentivize their way to victory. The bulk of the climate plan is the carbon price. And in the case of, what are they trying to do to encourage clean tech industries and their adoption? They've offered a 50% corporate income tax cut to those companies, and more recently, a tax credit to cover the upfront capital costs. Those things are going to have an impact, but it's going to be marginal. This is no way to prosecute a battle for our lives.
So what do you, when you think about state-led clean tech adoption, what does that look like?
Well, it means what I said before: spend what it takes to create new crown enterprises and move to mandatory measures. So let me give you some concrete examples there. Take heat pumps, electric heat pumps. In our province, in British Columbia, we have a provincial government that's giving some fairly sizable rebates for people to do that. I've done it. I've electrified my home. But when I did it, I went to see the Minister for Environment and Climate Change to say, I've done it. I've claimed your rebate. And I have to tell you, if we're hoping that thousands and thousands of people are going to voluntarily do what you want them to do, we are fried. It's not going to work. It's still too expensive. It's still too complicated. What if we had a crown enterprise or a subsidiary of BC Hydro that was mass producing electric heat pumps, get the profit motive out, get the economy of scale, and an army of installers to come into our homes and show us how to do it? Don't make me go to get quotes from 5 different contractors and try to figure out which one is bilking me the least. It's not going to happen at a voluntary level like that. You need the policy carrots that bring the price down and the policy sticks that make it mandatory. Otherwise, it will not happen at scale. And I can tell you right now that as many as there are a few thousand people each year who are using those rebates and converting their homes. But Fortis BC is tying up new homes to gas lines at a rate of 3 to 5 times faster each year. They're running circles around us, and we will never hit those building targets until we get serious about this.
I think Seth's example illustrates the pitfalls of voluntary incremental changes perfectly. We've seen far too often that companies left alone will prioritize profits over doing the right thing. It wasn't until government policy came into play that corporations really began making emission-reducing pledges and adopting ESG mandates. Public pressure and consumer sentiment has also forced many industries to adopt cleaner, more equitable policies as well. And we can't take our foot off the gas. The government needs an effective strategy and the coordination of funding and policies to better enable the deployment of clean tech and get us on track to achieve a net zero economy.
I think our task as Canadians is to force our government into emergency mode. And it's a bit of a leap of faith. We have to do so knowing, trusting that millions of other people of goodwill around the world are doing the same with their governments. And hopefully we'll all succeed in time.
And you think the reason that government isn't taking as bold of a step as they need to is because the other parties just aren't making those commitments, so it's loss of power?
No, I think the main reason they're not there is in some ways that neoliberal legacy that I mentioned before. Why aren't they spending what it takes to win? Why aren't they creating new crown enterprises? Why aren't they moving to mandatory? Because they're caught in this straitjacket of thinking about what is and isn't possible and allowed. In writing my book, I was trying to excavate this 80-year-old reminder that we actually can do all those things. I wrote the whole book just before the pandemic, where in fact we have had a reminder. I think if you look at the first year of the pandemic, the government mostly hit the markers. And if you had said to me, a few weeks before the pandemic, are there people at the Bank of Canada and Finance Canada capable of pivoting in the space of weeks and creating these audacious new programs like the CERB and the wage subsidy? I would have said, no, there's no one home who thinks that way, and I would have been wrong. So this is the thing I take away from my study of emergencies, the war, the pandemic, climate. 2 lessons, if you will. One is all emergencies start with a period of denial. World War II, they started in denial. We were all in denial at the beginning of the pandemic about how it was going to upend our lives. And we're all in some measure of climate denial about what it really means and the bargains that we're still trying to make with the laws of nature. But my second observation is that at some point, some alchemy happens, some combination of events and leadership that shifts the public zeitgeist and moves us into emergency mode. That happened in the war. It happened in the early weeks and months of the pandemic. In the case of climate, those events are happening. That's what these extreme weather events are. Unhelpfully, they don't happen everywhere all at once, and so they don't galvanize us all at once. But the leadership isn't there yet. Historians refer to the first 9 months of World War II as the phony war. We declared war, but not really. This is the phony war period of the climate emergency, where we declare emergency, but not really. And it's no fun being in the phony war period, wrestling with this disconnect, this dissonance between what we know we have to do and the political response to date. But phony wars don't last.
Is there a parallel to when that shift from the phony war to the real war happened, where there was an indicator that we're going to see or have to see?
I think it's different every time, but the commonality I see is that alchemy of events and leadership. So in the war, it was the fall of France, right? And all of a sudden people were like, whoa, this is serious. But it also took leadership, right? Like people, when I was sharing with people the premise of my book while I was writing, people were like, oh yeah, but everyone understood the threat then, to be clear and present. No, they didn't. Not if you were in Canada. It was on the other side of 2 oceans. It took work on the part of leadership to get the public where they needed to be. And in COVID, I don't know what you remember in terms of events. I remember when they canceled the NBA season. I don't even watch basketball, but I remember thinking, wow, that's different. And then I remember seeing our prime minister in front of his house every morning, giving us those briefings to signal that a genuine emergency response was here. So we all have a recent experience of what a genuine emergency response looks and sounds and feels like. But it hasn't come yet for climate.
Given the decades of warnings from the scientific community and more recently the increasingly volatile and unpredictable weather events that are affecting us more and more often, it's hard to understand how we're still in the phony war period of the climate emergency. We have all the evidence we need to understand how much the climate emergency has affected us and solid evidence to predict how severely it could impact our planet in the future. And I think that's why it's so important for us to advocate for the policies that will enable clean tech adoption in Canada fast. We must deploy these innovations in order to reduce our emissions and achieve our net zero goals. And we need our government to play a leadership role in adopting these solutions and setting the tone for the climate emergency. But for the innovators in Canada, there are some things you can do in order to increase the appeal of your solutions to customers, whether they're from government or industry. One of those things is developing a strong IP strategy. Joining us today are Roch Ripley, a partner at Gowling WLG's Vancouver office and the head of Gowling's intellectual property department, and Phuong No, a partner at Gowling's Ottawa office and the leader of Gowling's procurement group.
Glad to be here. Thanks for having us.
Hi, thanks for having us.
This is so timely. Foresight's been working on what we're calling a net zero integrated marketplace, which is effectively a matchmaking service between ventures and technologies that are ready to deploy and buyers, which can include industry and government. And quite frankly, the question around procurement practices and what's allowable given some of the different trade regulations and things like that is a really hot topic. So let's dig into that. Starting with a broader based question, both of you can chime in. Let's start with you, Phuong. What is the government's role in your perspective in the adoption of clean technologies? And should government be taking a leadership role?
Well, I guess the question can be broken down into two. As a purchaser, the government has a role in being able to define what it wants to buy, how it buys it, and if it decides that it wants to adopt clean technology and things like that, they have the ability to do that as a purchaser, right, with their buying power. But as a regulator, in the sense that they're a world player in various accords and things like that, I think they have also a leadership role when they engage with the global community in terms of our commitments with respect to clean tech and the environment and things like that. So I think they wear two hats in being able to do that. And should they play a role? I think they do in the sense that they are the leaders. And so what they do, many other countries will look at, and other public organizations like the province or municipalities or various crown corps and things like that will also look to the federal government, for instance, to see what they're doing and take some notes from that as well.
Roch, what do you think?
Yeah, I agree. So I think that generally there are a couple roles for government to play. So first, I'll call it the investment side. That is helping businesses and companies get started. And I think the government does a good job here. You look at investment provided directly to companies through, a bit of an alphabet soup of organizations, right? IRAP, FRED, IAC, and there are others. Those are very useful programs. You look at indirect investment, such as funding provided to accelerators like Foresight or other accelerators and the supercluster network and what have you. So I think on that investment get off the ground side, I think there's a role there to play. And I think the government takes it seriously and plays it pretty well. The other role I see where I think, in my opinion, they could do a better job is being Canadian companies' first customer. I've got a lot of clients that will complain to me about they have products that seem to have a good fit with governmental needs, but they do have a lot of trouble navigating whatever it may be, procurement or establishing the relationships to get provincial or federal governments to buy their products and actually help Canadian companies do commercialization. It's anecdotal, but I've heard enough anecdotes that I think it's a problem. And I also, contrast us with places where, like the United States, it's 10 times bigger. You may not need that helping hand as much, but I sort of compare us to South Korea, and there they did do a lot of government support like that while those industries were forming. And now, my house is filled with Samsung and LG equipment that is world leading and that is absolutely competitive. So I think in terms of helping Canadian companies be the first customer, I think there's a role to play there. And personally, I think there's, some work to be done there.
Now, leaning into sort of the government's buying practices, and I know we're sort of mobilizing from municipalities all the way up through the federal agencies, and a lot of them, each of those groups have different flexibilities in how they can do things, is my understanding. Correct me if I'm wrong, but does having a robust IP strategy contribute to a company's attractiveness, as a partner for government as they try to decarbonize their operations?
So in terms of a robust IP strategy, my experience is that at the point of actually making a decision, probably not directly like that, but I think having a robust IP strategy is core to just having a good business. So in terms of having differentiated products and services where you can go to the government or any other customer and say, this is why you should buy from us because you can't get it anywhere else and we have a superior solution. I think having a robust IP strategy is really important for that. So it can get you to the door. But in my experience, once you're there, once you've got that differentiated product and the product is speaking for itself or you're speaking for it, it's not so much, well, we're not sold on the product or service, but we see you have a good IP strategy. We'll buy your product or service. I don't think that happens. But I think in terms of having that differentiated and market-leading product and service, I think an IP strategy is really important there.
I think from I deal with a lot of levels of government. One of the things that I see in IP-related issues, whether it's in clean tech or not, is that some public entities have standard terms and conditions with respect to IP and how they want to deal with it or how they address it from a contractual perspective. I think part of understanding how to do business with a government organization also requires, as part of your strategy, not just your rights and what you have, is to understand how they approach IP and what kind of terms that they tend to impose, because you need to understand what you're getting into in those instances. And in some cases, it's a standard language, and in others, it's not as well defined. So understanding the approaches the government entity that you're dealing with deals with and how they deal with IP is actually a first step from an educational perspective on getting ready to do business with some public organization, whether it's federal or municipal, provincial, or whatever in between, right?
Phuong, I think that's a really good point, actually. I mean, you and I were just looking at some of I think it was the federal government standard terms and conditions for IP the other day. And the way I characterized it was, if I were drafting terms and conditions for a party that had a lot of power and that was very conservative, those would be the exact kinds of terms and conditions I would draft. So, for example, the default standard ones we were looking at said that if the government was procuring some kind of service from a company, any modifications made to a company's IP as part of that government retainer would be owned by the government. And that has serious implications. So if you're a company and part of your business model is, we're going to take what we learn from each retainer with different customers and use it to better our product and then resell that improved product, those standard terms and conditions won't let you do that for that government retainer, which means it's certainly either something you want to negotiate and bring up, or you have to structure your business or your commercialization plans in a way where what you do for the government is not going to be reused for other customers. It also has implications for what kind of background IP you're bringing to the table. Do you have the right to license or assign that to the government? And do you understand that very important delineation between what you're bringing to the retainer or to the contract and what you're creating in the course of performing the contract? So stuff like that is important to remember when you're agreeing to any contract, and in particular, maybe the standard terms the government may offer.
It's interesting. This got me thinking, and again, I'm coming at this from, like you said, a lot of these companies have challenges getting procurement. Some folks get nervous about even looking at solutions because of the procurement regulations and the trade guidelines. But could one argue that if you have exclusive rights to a solution and there is not a comparable solution available on the market, does that give you more flexibility under some of these procurement rules, laws, or guidelines?
In the trade agreements, there are some exceptions or some exemptions that under certain circumstances, the government can take a more flexible instead of running competitive processes or whatever. The standard terms and conditions may not necessarily always fall under the trade agreements, and it just may be a policy or a commercial position that the Crown has decided to take. I think if you have a very innovative, you're the only one out there, it definitely gives you some leverage to try to maneuver and negotiate the clauses. But the starting point is usually always, what is it that the government is currently using and how flexible will they be? And I think your chances would increase, obviously, if you are quite unique in the space and you're providing something something new and isn't already out there. So, but you would definitely want to look at that in the context of what the existing framework for IP is before you look into it. I would say if you have questions, obviously there are links on the government websites and things like that, depending on which jurisdiction you're in. But there are rules that they have to follow, but as long as you understand how they approach those rules, it shouldn't be so daunting. That's the one thing I want to encourage people. You may not necessarily have resources to deal with a lawyer in every single case, but understanding the landscape, they have rules they need to follow. They have parameters when they can do certain things. That's true. But they do have some flexibility, and just understanding how they can exercise that flexibility is just something that should not be a barrier to at least looking at this from an opportunity perspective.
Roch, did you want to weigh in?
I mean, I'll just emphasize a point that I think I raised earlier and that I sort of use when I discuss these issues with clients. It's not IP that is your product, but IP supports your product. So if you have that distinct, differentiated product, if you have exclusive rights to the product, I think that definitely gives you more bargaining power, not because you have the IP per se, but because the IP grants you exclusivity. And if any customer, including the government, wants your good product, and you're the only one who has it by virtue of your IP rights, it's that good differentiated product that gives you a better bargaining position.
Yep, 100%. As a CEO of a tech startup, I've done it a few times, and our IP portfolio was such a strategic priority for us in terms of creating that space and confidence around our products and services that you can't repeat it. Otherwise, folks have to engage you for licensing contracts, etc.
And bear in mind that a lot of the reasons why the government takes this approach is because they want to have some flexibility as well. Like if they do purchase, an item, that future issues like repair, maintenance, and overhaul and things like that can't be, forevermore just the one supplier. And they have many other types of policy, and that's just one of them, right? And so there are reasons for a very broad IP type of strategy, but there has to be, I think, some acknowledgement that in some cases you can't just take that one size fits all approach for the clauses and conditions that they tend to use.
Roch, back over to you. How does having IP protection in place protect a clean tech venture when they are approaching industry and government partners?
Well, I think it gives you the ability to say you do have an exclusive product. I mean, fundamentally, if you're going to sell your product or service, a customer, the government, or anybody will say, or they'll think to themselves before they agree to purchase your service for hopefully a lot of money. Why are we spending this? Can we get it somewhere else? Can we do it ourselves? And IP is one component of how you say to your customer, you actually need us. You can't just do it for yourselves. Not only do we have the people and the relationships and the contracts, but on top of all that, and to complement all of that, we also have IP protecting the various aspects of the product. So, when people think IP, often they think only patents. As an IP lawyer, I think more than that. And patents, copyright, trade secrets, etc. But for clean tech in particular, I think patents are very important. A lot of these clean tech innovations are tangible. They're big capital costs and what have you. And that is exactly what patents were meant to protect. If you do have a patent or another kind of IP that protects your product, any customer can do a search and they can see, well, not only is it practically going to be very difficult to do this for ourselves or to source this product from somebody else, but legally, we just can't do it. To overcome that would be so difficult and so onerous, we should just buy the product from the person who made it.
Phuong, your landscape perspective on procurement with all levels of government is super fascinating to me. Do you have, a checklist or a set of tips, 1, 3, 5 things that you would recommend to innovators and tech companies that are looking to sell to government?
I can say a couple of things. If you're uploading any kind of procurement vehicle, a request for proposals, a tender, standing offers, standing agreements, anything, look at it very carefully. A lot of times there are terms and conditions, there are policies, or there are other things that are incorporated by reference. So it's just mentioned. And so it's not just the 4 corners of that document. You do need to kind of review everything and understand what it is that you're, getting into. So it's not just the pages in front of you, there might be more, and you need to figure all of those things out because they would apply to you. The second thing would be to understand that you do have processes, if a procurement process is ongoing, to ask questions, to seek clarifications, to understand the scope better. That is an ability that bidders have in those opportunities. You have to also think from a strategic perspective, do I really want to ask the question or not? But you do have a forum to deal with those and address those issues. The third would be to really take a good hard look at all of the things that you would be asked to agree to, the must, the shall, the certifications and things like that, because they pose a high risk. Understanding the IP provisions and things like that obviously come into play because, as Roch has said, you may be in a position where you're giving away more rights than you want to, or that you actually are not in a position to grant those licenses because you don't have that ability. And those are important things to look at. So I think really taking a look at the document and what it is asking for and what it is you're committing to is actually really important. So my tips are always to read everything from top to bottom, understand that you have an ability to ask questions and answers, and take a look at what it is you're committing to that doesn't look like there's going to be a lot of wiggle room on. I hope that gives a little bit of a roadmap to kind of understand how to read a procurement document. They generally follow a similar pattern of what the objective is, how the public entity is going to pick or select the winner, and on what basis, and then what that contract looks like at the end. So you would always expect that kind of information set out in the package.
Very helpful. Thank you, Phuong. And Roch, of course, over to you to close us out here. When it comes to everything IP for industry or government procurement processes, what do you want the audience to take home, whether they're an investor, a venture, a buyer, any angle you want?
The message I have is, and this is not going to be news to anybody listening, to succeed and demand high margins in the marketplace, you need that differentiated product or service. Then the question arises, how do you maintain that differentiation? There are lots of practical ways: relationships, talent, contracts. IP is an important part of that network of protections that you use to maintain that differentiation. It's going to be noticed by customers, by investors, by potential acquirers. So when you're protecting your product and service, when you're looking to secure your place in the market, remember IP is part of that core set of things you have to do to run your business well.
I don't think the work Seth has done could be any more clear. And it's incredible we have service providers from groups like Gowlings that are here to help clean tech companies really navigate their path to commercialization and adoption. But we need to work together. Thanks for listening. Don't forget to subscribe to the Cleantech Forward podcast wherever you listen, and to share this episode with your friends and colleagues. We'll be back again next month with the first episode in our series on Canada's position internationally as an exporter of clean tech and how we can position ourselves as a global leader in the space. We'll see you there.
To learn more about Foresight's programs, events, and more, visit us at foresightcac.com or follow us on social at ForesightCAC.